It's federal budget eve and there are whispers of a Friday election call to allow the government to ride some positive momentum. I'm Tom Lowrey, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The federal government has finalised an agreement with Queensland for a new $2.8 billion public school funding deal. Queensland is the last state to sign up to the agreement, which the Premier says is due to challenges no other state has. What can schools do with the new investment? I'll ask the Education Minister, Clare, in a moment. The government has defended its plans to introduce legislation this week to protect the Tasmanian salmon industry from legal action by environmental groups, saying it makes no apologies for supporting jobs. The crossbench has slammed the government over its focus on salmon, claiming it's ignoring the cost of living. So is the government just trying to neutralise an election issue? I'll ask Shadow Environment Minister John O'Doniam. Tomorrow's federal budget will show $2.1 billion in savings, partly thanks to a reduction of spend on consultants, according to the Finance Minister. It will also show taxation has fallen to the lowest level as a share of the economy since the pandemic. Will this budget be a net positive for the government on the eve of an election? I'll ask my panel Jane Hume and Murray Watt. To our top story today, and Queensland will join other states and territories in a deal to make up the funding shortfall for public education with an extra $2.8 billion from the Commonwealth over the next decade. The Prime Minister stood up with Premier David Shoebridge to spruik the announcement this morning.
We accounted for most of this investment is already in my EFO. There will be some additional investment given to Queensland that will be accounted for in the pre-election fiscal outlook. This is an investment in our young Australians. I can't think of anything that is more worthwhile.
Earlier I spoke with Federal Education Minister Clare. Clare, thanks for joining Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
The school funding puzzle is now somewhat complete with Queensland having signed on. With this whole picture now in place, is money the solution to the problems education's facing broadly? Is that sort of the message here?
Well, it's two things. It's funding, but it's got to be tied to real reform. Reforms that are going to help our children who fall behind to catch up at school and to keep up and to finish school. You know, the big challenge that we're confronting at the moment is the number of kids finishing high school is dropping. Not everywhere, not in the non-government system, but certainly in our public schools. It's dropped from about 83% about 7 or 8 years ago down to 73%. And as you know, as everyone watching knows, it's more important to finish school today than it was when we were at school. We've got to turn that around. And that's why we have been insistent that this can't be a blank cheque. This is the biggest investment by the Commonwealth government in public education ever. It's worth about $16.5 billion over the next 10 years. But it's not a blank cheque. It's tied to the biggest set of reforms to education in decades.
I wanted to touch on those targets. I think you have a Year 12 completion rate target of around 84% or so by the end of the decade. Is that achievable? That would be a record high.
The key to achieving that is making sure that the young people who are falling behind in primary school get the extra support they need. You know, what NAPLAN data shows us is that the children who fall behind in their first test when they're 8 years old, 4 out of 5 of those children are still behind when they set the NAPLAN test in Year 9. In other words, 80% of the children who are behind when they're little are still behind when they're in the middle of high school. They're the children most likely to not finish high school. What we also know is if you intervene early, if you identify those children early, even before they sit that test, maybe in kindergarten, prep, Year 1, and you provide them with extra individualised support, then they can catch up faster. Things like catch-up tutoring, where a child gets taken out of a class of 30 children into a class with 3 or 4 days a week for 40 minutes. If it's done right, then a child can learn as much in 6 months as they normally learn in 12 months. In other words, they catch up. That's the sort of real practical reform that's going to make a difference to help more young people finish high school.
Yeah, there's a clause in these agreements that requires, I think, evidence-based teaching is the language. For those that don't know, what are you sort of referring to there? And are you intervening in how teachers should run their classrooms?
No, I think the reading wars are over. I think the evidence is now pretty clear about how to teach children to read, about all of the techniques that really work. Synthetic phonics is a classic example of that. all of the evidence shows us what works to help young people learn. We're embedding that in the curriculum in the university degrees, but this will help to roll that out in classrooms across the nation as well. And state ministers, state governments are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that regard right across the country.
Public schools aren't going to be fully funded nationwide still for some time. There's still a process to grow the funding to get to that point. At the same time, we always hear stories about private schools building new pools or orchestra pits, or I think someone has a Scottish castle. Is there work to do on the private school funding side of the ledger, do you think?
Well, first, this is not about building classrooms. It's about the children in the classrooms. It's the investment in the children.
But it says something about school funding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This takes us back to the work that David Gonski did more than 10 years ago, and he set a formula for how we should fund our schools, private schools and public schools. Private schools are funded at that level that David Gonski said they should be at all those years ago. Public schools aren't, not until now. That's why today's a big day. This is a big deal. No government has ever done this before, ever. This agreement that we've now struck with every state and territory means that every public school across the country is going to be funded at that level that David Gonski said they should be at, and it ratchets up year after year after year to get to that level. I'm a kid from a public school in the western suburbs of Sydney. I'm the first person in my family to finish school, first person in my family to finish year 10. I'm only here because of the schools I went to, the teachers who taught me. I understand how important it is. This sort of investment tied to these sorts of reforms are going to help kids like the kid I was, the kids that I went to school with. It's going to help to make sure that every child in the country, wherever they go to school, whether it's a non-government school or a government school, get the resources and the support that they need to get a great start in life.
I want to touch on another issue going on in education, higher education in fact. The US has been reviewing funding agreements with Australian universities. Do you have a picture yet of the impact of those reviews? I think they're being sent questionnaires almost on their ideological positions to try and justify the funding they're receiving. Yeah,
we're starting to get more information. This emerges out of a review that the US government has initiated into foreign aid, and research has been caught in that. We understand that at least 7 Australian universities have been affected by this. Their research that they're conducting, research that's either been suspended or stopped. I've asked my department to work with those universities, get more information from other Australian universities about potential research that might be affected. And the Australian Embassy in Washington is working with US departments to get a better understanding of this. We expect that the outcomes of that review that the US has initiated will be clearer in the second half of April. But Australian universities do great research. To put it in perspective, we're a nation that represents about 0.3% of the globe's population, but we do 3% of the world's research. So we punch above our weight. It's the reason that countries like the US want to work with us and work with our universities. Ultimately, the US will make their own decisions about the research that they want to fund. But we think it's worth working with Australia because we've got great universities.
Yeah, look, some of these questions that academics are being asked, things like, can you confirm that your organisation does not work with any party that espouses anti-American beliefs, or that this work is not climate or environmental justice sort of projects? Is that appropriate to be asking Australian academics those kinds of questions about their research? Is it foreign interference even?
No, I don't think it is. Look, this is US-funded research of US universities working with Australian universities. Ultimately, it's up to the US about what research it wants to fund. I would advocate for the US to want to work with our universities because they're some of the best in the world. And that's why the Australian Embassy is working with US officials to get a better understanding about this issue.
What's your advice to those universities? Should they write back? Should they fill in these questionnaires?
They are. I think overwhelmingly, it's not universities themselves, but it's individual researchers in our universities that are responding to requests from individual researchers in individual US universities. But it's not just the universities that are answering these questions. We're seeking further information from the US.
Would you consider, or the Australian government consider, stepping in to fill the breach if some of this funding is pulled? You mentioned the sort of valuable work they're doing.
No, I don't think it's practical for the Australian government to underwrite this sort of research. But whether it's the United States or whether it's Europe or anybody else that collaborates with Australian universities, they know, like we know, that our universities are some of the best in the world. Our researchers are extraordinary. I encourage them to continue the work they're doing.
Just quickly on the budget we're going to see tomorrow, anything in particular to look out for in the education space? And do you think there's broadly concerns about the government handing down a big spending budget? Is that what Australians want to see at this point in time with inflation still a concern?
I think most Australians want to make sure we're investing in the areas that are going to set us up for the future, and that's what education does. Three big things in my area. One is cutting the cost of childcare for more than 1 million Australian families. We announced that almost 2 years ago, implemented that almost 2 years ago. That continues to have a big impact for families across the country. For the average family with one child in childcare, it saves them more than $2,000 a year. Then there's the big investment that we're making in our schools that are going to help more children to finish high school. We want more young people to be able to finish high school, then go on to TAFE or to university, and that's where free TAFE comes in. And that's also where cutting the cost of HECS comes in. We've said that if we win the next election, we'll cut the cost of HECS debt for 3 million Australians by 20%. Now, to give you an example about what that means, the average HECS debt today is about 27 grand. If we win the election, we'll be able to implement that change that will cut that debt for that individual by $5,500. That's a lot of money in people's pockets. You'll see that in the budget tomorrow night.
Just quickly on your part of the world in Western Sydney, there's been a lot of talk about how the conflict in Gaza is cutting through to voters, particularly in your electorate and the electorate surrounding it. Are you concerned that issue might see Labor bleed votes to the Greens and to some high-profile independents as well?
Yeah, I don't take any vote for granted. I've had the privilege to represent Western Sydney, the area that I grew up now for a long time. I work my guts out for my community every single day, but I also know that my community is hurting in a way that not every community is. This isn't a conflict on the other side of the world for my community. It's much closer to home. The dead bodies that they see on television sometimes are family, they're relatives. And so it affects my community in a very unique and personal way. And so I'm very conscious of that. My job is to represent my community every single day, the best I can, and I'll continue to do that.
Jason Clare, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
To unpack a bit of that and look ahead to tomorrow's budget, we're joined now by political reporter Tom Crowley. Tom, thanks for being here.
Tom, great to be with you.
Look, we just heard Jason Clare there giving us a bit of the budget sell in the education space. The government's, warmed up for the budget tomorrow night, but do you think this is a budget they would have rather avoided altogether? Are they happy to be here?
Well, the main reason I think that they might have wanted to avoid it is that it's going to be deficits as far as the eye can see. We already knew that. It's not new information, but the last time that Jim Chalmers stood on his feet in the House of Reps to deliver a budget speech, he was able to point to a surplus in the year that was about to end. That's in the past now. It's harder for Labor to make that kind of surplus-based responsible economic management argument that they've been trying to make. That's perhaps why this week we've seen them framing the conversation around tax, spending and debt, highlighting the achievements as they see it over the course of their term. It's very clearly a pre-election narrative. But look, it's an opportunity in some ways to point to some of the areas, as Jason Clare did there, that they think are going to be crucial in the campaign. We've seen in the last couple of weeks things that were probably meant to be election campaign drops, election campaign announcements, like the Medicare one, like the energy bill relief. Well, now they're using a budget week to warm up some of those messages, talk to households about the cost of living when it comes to energy, talk about housing, talk about education and HECS. Hone all of these messages for the campaign trail and have a week to say, look, here we are, we're still the government, we're in Parliament House, we're handing down a budget, here are all the things that we're offering to you. It's a big set piece, although of course Peter Dutton will get to end the week with a set piece of his own. Yeah,
I'm going to come to Peter Dutton in a sec, but you mentioned some of the big commitments there, the $8.5 billion for bulk billing, for example. We've seen some of those policies rolled out. There's so much we already know, including that the budget's going to be in deficit tomorrow night. What's left to learn in the budget papers when we see them tomorrow?
Not much, but then again, that's become the norm really for budgets in the last few years, that there aren't too many surprises left on the night. And the night itself, to the extent that people actually watch the budget speech, it becomes about packaging up a narrative.
Everybody does, Tom, sure.
Oh, of course,
the nation
yes. Well,
stops.
I'll be watching, of course, with bated breath. But I think it becomes a political framing exercise. I mean, it's almost taken on the character of Australia's equivalent of the State of the Union. loath to make too many American comparisons, but it has that feeling, a big centrepiece speech. Here's how the government is threading all the elements together, which you might already know, but here's how we'll tell a story. And Jim Chalmers, one of the government's best communicators, gets the chance to frame the entire election narrative together in one big bow. So in a sense, I mean, who knows? There may well be a surprise that we don't know about. We always have that caveat. But even if there isn't, it's a chance for the government to tie all of those loose ends together into one story.
You were poring over some past budget papers over the past week or so. I'm curious, Labor hates its tag as the lesser economic manager compared to the coalition. How do you think the government's gone in trying to shake that label over the past few years?
Well, the key word again has been surplus. It's that thing that they've pointed to over and over again. We've delivered 2 budget surpluses. That is the silver lining, really, of the inflation crisis that has shaped Labor's term. I mean, without inflation, a first-term Labor government would probably have gone a lot further on a lot of the spending measures that Jim Chalmers and Katie Gallagher repeatedly say they would love to do if they could afford it. The circumstances haven't allowed that. Instead, Labor has had to tighten its belt at least a little bit, spend where it can. That's where the surpluses have been so important to that narrative. The reason they've been able to do that is because inflation's driven up the tax takes so much. So many of those extra billions have been able to improve the budget bottom line a little bit. That's what they'll point to this time around. But it's the economic conditions, it's inflation, it's the pain that people are feeling out in the electorate that makes it so hard for any government in this position, but particularly I think for a Labor government that, as you say, is battling against that perception, to be able to make that clean argument. And that's where it all relies on that rate cut that they got recently and saying, look, we've turned a corner. That's key to the pitch.
Just quickly on Peter Dutton, he's forward sizzling a big policy announcement in his budget reply speech on Thursday. Anything in particular you're expecting? What would you be looking out for?
Well, there are a number of areas that we might expect to hear more because it's fair to say just about every area of policy the coalition has been telling us for ages, teasing us there's going to be more to come before the election. Well, we're running out of time and we don't have a lot of specifics. So whether it's on the energy front, whether it's on the housing front, whether it's on the migration front, Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor on Insiders yesterday really struggled to land a blow on any of those things or give a definitive answer about the coalition's plans for any of them. So as we approach an election, this is a really significant and important opportunity for Peter Dutton to be able to start with a bang and say, well, here is the policy platform that we haven't, okay, as an opposition, prepared over the last 2 or 3 years, but now we're ready. That's what we need to hear from him on Thursday night.
Tom Crowley, thanks so much for making the time this hour.
Pleasure.
As we just mentioned, the government is drip-feeding out many elements of this week's federal budget, and over the weekend the biggest part of that was the announcement that the Albanese government would extend its energy rebates until the end of 2025. The extension of the rebates is set to cost $1.8 billion over the forward estimates.
When they come into power, they promise to reduce our energy bills, but instead they're giving taxpayers' money back to people, giving back to people to pay back out to those multinationals. This is absolutely the most ridiculous situation to be in, I can assure you. So I really have a problem with this, and it's not means tested. What do I need $150 for? What a waste of money. I would rather those people down here getting $300 power relief rather than me getting another $150. Yeah. I mean, this is just ridiculous, Sarah. This is a promise that they made the Australian people that they would fix what is going on with our energy costs. And this is not a way of fixing it, and it's not a way of reducing it. And the best way to do this is, once again, have the guts and the courage to put in a 15% reserve policy, gas reserve policy, a gas reserve policy in. And they're not doing it. And you know why? Because God forbid if they were to upset their donors. And this is all it comes down to. And I see the Liberal Party standing by it, Sarah, because quite frankly, their idea of nuclear power and the billions of dollars we have to spend on it is just not going to work. Yeah. It's just not going to happen.
Jackie Lambie there with some strong thoughts. To discuss all things pre-budget, I spoke to our political panel for today, Employment Minister Murray Watt and Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume, a short time ago. Murray Watt, thanks for joining me.
G'day, Tom.
Jane Hume, thanks to you as well.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Murray, just first to you, something I wanted to cover off quickly. Labor's pulled down a social media post that repurposed a racist slogan on a T-shirt. It said something like, "This is Australia, we eat meat, we drink beer and we love Medicare." Did Labor miss the mark on this one?
Yeah, and we've already said so publicly. Obviously, that was an inappropriate post to go up. Sometimes some of our social media enthusiasts get a little bit too enthusiastic, and I think that's an example of that. So obviously it missed the mark. I'm glad it's been pulled down.
Just on tomorrow's budget, it's going to be in the red as far as the eye can see. How do you sell that to voters?
Well, I think voters can see over the last 3 years the Albanese government has delivered responsible economic management, especially in very uncertain global times. 2 consecutive surpluses, the first time we we've seen that for a couple of decades. Not one surplus delivered under a coalition government, but two under a Labor government, all while making sure that we were delivering important cost of living relief. So that's the same sort of approach that we'll take this time, making sure that the economic approach that we take remains responsible while helping Australians as much as we can. The announcements we've already made around energy rebates, cheaper medicines are a sign that we recognise people still need support, and I hope that we receive that support from the coalition going forward.
Jane, the Treasurer and the Finance Minister both unwilling to say when the budget will return to surplus. Would the coalition deliver a surplus in its first term?
Well, certainly we won't take the objective of returning to structural balance out of our objectives. There should be a credible pathway back to a structural balance, if only in the medium term. Now, doing it in the short term is going to be very hard, even for a coalition government which will instil back that fiscal discipline back into our budgetary processes. But now there is so much baked-in Labor spending that unwinding that, or walking away from that, or growing the economy to beat that is going to take some time. That's really frustrating. But what's more frustrating is the fact that the Labor government, and indeed Jim Chalmers as Treasurer and Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister, crowed about these windfall surpluses and yet have walked away from the responsibility of a deficit, walked away from a responsibility of deficits as far as the eye can see, and have essentially waved the white flag and said, not our problem, not our responsibility, and not our fault either. Now, that's unacceptable. If you can claim a surplus, surely you can claim a deficit, Murray.
Well, I think, Tom, unlike Jane and her colleagues, we didn't bother printing coffee mugs that said back in the black. We actually delivered back in the black. We did it twice in a row.
But now they're red. Where are your red coffee mugs, Murray?
Well, we don't worry about coffee mugs, Jane. We actually just worry about delivering good economic management, which is what we've done. I think the other important thing, Tom, this week is that this is finally an opportunity for Peter Dutton and the coalition to outline their economic plan. They've had nearly 3 years to do so. They still haven't done so. And this would be a great week for Jane and her colleagues to outline exactly where those 36,000 job cuts in the public service will actually
I'm happy to outline our economic plan right now for you, Murray, if you like, because we have a plan to get the economy back on track with a back-to-basics approach. We'll make sure that we rein in that wasteful government expenditure, and there's been plenty of it. We have a whole website full of it, www.underlabor.com.
But does it say where the job cuts are going to come from,
And we'll make
Jane?
sure that we bring inflation back under control in a permanent way. We'll deliver lower energy prices, affordable homes. We'll make sure that we deliver quality healthcare and that we restore public safety and law and order, and most importantly, safer communities.
Just on the public service in particular, the government says it saved $4.7 billion on spending at consultants across this first term. In principle, is it better to employ public servants than consultants? Do you agree with that as a general sort of idea?
The most important thing is to deliver better public services, and that hasn't happened under this government. In fact, a bigger public service doesn't necessarily mean better public services. We've seen the size of the health department increase by around 40%, but bulk billing has collapsed. We've seen almost a doubling of the size of the environment and energy portfolio, and yet approval times have stretched out and emissions have gone up. And we've seen thousands of people added to Services Australia, and yet the wait time to get an age pension has blown out by nearly 50%.
What about, say,
5 times longer to get a low-income card, and an hour-long wait on the phone of the Parenting and Families Helpline.
What about, say, Veterans Affairs as one example, though? Clearly more staff there has helped clear that backlog of processing times for veterans waiting for their claims.
And we've said that we won't be cutting frontline services. We'll make sure that we guarantee the essential services that Australians expect and deserve, but we want to make sure that government services are delivered efficiently. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need more people. And for all the fact that the government have said that they've made cuts to consultants, they've actually added 36,000 new public servants. That's 40 new public servants every single day since they came to office, and that costs around $6 billion more every single year.
So when you say no frontline services, what are the sort of back office roles you think the government can do without?
As we said, we're not going to cut frontline services, but we want to make sure that services that can be delivered are delivered more efficiently.
And how are you going to do that? It's all very well to have these sort of global statements about back in the black, back on track, all these sort of general statements, but no one has any detail yet about what you're going to do and where you're going to make the cuts.
Are you really seriously saying to me, Murray, that you think that this is an efficient delivery of government services as could be achieved?
What I think is that many of the facts that you keep citing are actually incorrect. We've actually checked some of the things you've been saying. As a result of the changes we've made and the conversion of external labour hire to public servants, we've more than halved the time older Australians wait for the age pension. Processing times for a low-income card have halved from 31 days to 16 days, and call wait times have fallen from an average of more than 30 minutes in 23-24 to just over 20 minutes in the last December quarter.
Not what the
so I don't know where you're getting your figures from,
the departments
but they
of the
are
last
actually
estimates.
the facts. They are actually the facts that show that the investment
told
in
us
the public
those
service,
data, and they did it at the last estimate. So if they've changed at these estimates only a few weeks later, I look forward to seeing that.
The investment in converting consultants and external labour hire, which costs taxpayers more to provide public service. Labour hire costs the taxpayer more than employing people directly because labour hire firms take a profit out of that. It costs more.
Just in principle, though, right? Is a bigger public service always better? We have seen, tens of thousands of new jobs out of the public service. Does Jane have a point that, the way government works hasn't dramatically improved?
Well, I would argue, and these facts show, that the provision of services to the Australian people has improved as a result of the investments that Labor has made in the public service.
So is the APS the right size now?
We think it's about the right size now. We think it was not adequately funded before, and the way the Coalition used to get around that was by outsourcing work to expensive consultants and labour hire firms that didn't meet the service standards people are now receiving. You've mentioned Veterans Affairs. There was a backlog of 42,000 claims from veterans when we came to office. That's been cleared as a result of the investments Labor's made in the public service and converting labour hire to permanent public service.
But if it's a backlog
so it's up
that
to
you're
the Coalition
clearing,
to say where are they going to cut these jobs?
Now?
But where are you going to cut the 36,000 jobs?
But this is what I'm interested in. If it's a backlog and you're clearing it, why do they need to be permanent staff? Wouldn't they be better off used somewhere else?
So we should now sack them, or we should now make them external labour hire again?
No, if you think that there are other backlogs, don't you think that it would be better to use them elsewhere? Are you using the resources of government as efficiently as possible?
I'm pretty staggered that you think that having finally cleared the backlog of veterans' claims, that we can go back to outsourcing them rather than keeping people there and keeping that backlog at zero.
If the backlog, if they're there to address a backlog and that's been done, what are all those staff doing now?
So James' point, is there a room for external consultants, I think, is the question here.
Of course, from time to time, the public service is going to need to bring in external skills, specialist skills that are available in the private sector. But it shouldn't be a default mechanism, which is what it got to under the Coalition. They had a public service cap, and the way they got around that was by outsourcing policy work and the provision of services to the private sector, which charged more, which cost taxpayers more. And as I say, what we're still waiting for from Jane and her colleagues is to find out where are these 36,000 job cuts going to be made, what agencies, which public servants will go. People deserve to know that before they vote.
Murray, can I just quickly ask you, we're on the eve of the election campaign, obviously. I just want to quiz you on two things that the government said in the past few days. One was putting out figures arguing workers would be $5,000 a week worse off if they lost work from home benefits. That's not coalition policy. It doesn't apply to the private sector. Also on the PBS, you've raised the possibility that Peter Dutton might trade off on the PBS somewhat with Donald Trump, which again the coalition has said it's not going to do. Is Labor going to rely on scare campaign tactics to try and win this election?
No. Just to start with, the work from home policy, and I don't know, today's Monday, I don't know what the policy from the coalition on work from home is because it changes every day.
It's not currently.
But you might remember where this started was Peter Dutton saying that he was going to stop work from home in the public sector. We've not said that it applies to the private sector, but there's legitimate complaints.
That's a Labor lie, Murray.
Concerns from women in the private sector that this might spread further.
It's an absolute nonsense, and that is a Labor lie.
The point about transport costs is about costing the average travel time and transport costs of people who commute to work in the CBD, their parking costs, their petrol costs and things like that. It stands to reason that people who work from home, who were under a Dutton government, would have to come to the city or come to their office to work every day. They're going to incur further costs.
Except they won't, because you're lying about it, Murray.
But you don't know what your policy is.
This is simply a scare campaign.
Every day the work from home policy changes.
Would you like me to explain it to you?
Well, what's today's version? It'll be different to yesterday's. 2 weeks ago, Michaelia Cash said publicly that you wanted public servants in the office 5 days a week. What's changed since Michaelia Cash made those comments 2 weeks ago?
So flexible work will always remain, and this is not a policy that affects the private sector. The private sector can do what it wants to create productivity. But at the moment, we have an arrangement whereby, arranged between the CPSU, the Community and Public Sector Union, Service Union, and the Finance Minister, we're embedded into the agreement between the public servants and the government, is the right to demand to work from home full-time. Now, Prior to COVID, about 22% of public servants worked from home. During COVID, that moved up to around 55%, and that was not dissimilar to the private sector. But it's now at 61%. And we're hearing from stakeholders that they do things like fly to Canberra with their team to present to people in a department, walk into a meeting room, and they meet with the public servants on video link or by phone. Now, that's kind of crazy. We had one example where one public servant came to us and said that a team member that worked with them was difficult to get hold of because they were working from home full time. In fact, they were travelling around Australia in a caravan with their family.
Just to nail this down, this is changing the EBA is what you want to do.
No, well, the EBAs remain. Of course, existing arrangements remain and will be entirely honoured. But this is about embedding a culture within the public service to make them understand that every dollar that they spend and every dollar that they earn is taxpayer money. It's money that somebody else has given up, asking them to serve them.
So what's the thing that the Coalition would do to try and get public servants back in the office more often?
We want to have a default position whereby if you accept a job with the public service, it's on the understanding that you work in the office. Now, flexible arrangements will always be allowed, always, but it has to work for the individual and the team and the department. That's the only way that we're going to create an effective and an efficient public service.
So Michaelia Cash was wrong. Michaelia Cash was wrong when she said 2 weeks ago that the expectation is that people will be in the office 5 days a week.
So the default position is that when you accept a job with the public service, that it will be from the office. But you can arrange to have flexible work, but it has to work for everybody. It can't just work for you, and you can't demand it.
All right, I have so many more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. Marion Watt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Jane.
Jane, thanks again.
Thanks, Marion. Thanks, Tom.
Ahead of the federal budget, there's been plenty of speculation around both sides of politics' commitment to raising defence spending, thanks to an uncertain geostrategic environment. Concerns over the AUKUS defence treaty under the Trump administration have increasingly been raised following the America First approach of the president. The Greens have waded into the debate with an election policy for Australia to pull out of deals with the United States for tanks, helicopters and submarines to build our own drones and missiles. For more on this, let's bring in the Greens Defence Spokesperson David Shoebridge. David, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
The Greens have previously advocated a reduction in defence spending as a proportion of GDP from where it currently is around 2% down to about 1.5%. Is that still the case?
Well, we have a different policy. We see there is a role for reducing overall defence expenditure, but the key way we see of doing that is pulling out of AUKUS and cancelling our reliance on a series of US weapons platforms that are not designed for Australia's defence. They're literally designed to enmesh us in the next US war. So the announcement we made on the weekend was if we cancel AUKUS and pull out of AUKUS, we have $75 billion in savings in the defence budget in the first decade. We get billions more by cancelling other US weapons platforms, such as tanks we can't move and 50-year-old helicopter plans, and reallocate a very small proportion of that, some $4 billion, in a domestic industry designed to defend Australia but not threaten our neighbours or engage us in the next US war. We see that as an enormous win-win. We not only have tens of billions of dollars to spend on schools and hospitals, but we also step away from this dangerous reliance on the United States.
Look, I want to come to AUKUS in a second, but just at a broad level, what is your view, what is the Greens' view of the geostrategic threats facing Australia and the ADF's role in that?
Well, we think our defence should be focused literally on defending Australia and our maritime and air approaches and not doing what AUKUS is intending to do, which is spend hundreds of billions of dollars for us to join with the United States and project force thousands and thousands of kilometres from our shores and engage in the next US war. We see a very different role, an independent role from Australia, where if we structure our defence force right, we can defend Australia's interests, but we send a very clear message to our neighbours that we're not here to threaten them and hopefully lead to a de-escalation in the region. It's part of our long-term commitment to peace and non-violence.
All right, so say we were to scrap AUKUS and free up that funding, where would you have that funding go?
Well, the bulk of the $75 billion can be reinvested in fighting the climate crisis, which we know is the single biggest national security threat that Australia faces. Working with our partners to secure them from the impacts we know are already pre-programmed from climate change, to secure their key infrastructure, build those supplies, but also a very small proportion of that, and we're talking $4 billion over 4 years, to build a domestic defence supply chain that disengages us from Donald Trump and the US military industry, that means we can end the two-way arms trade with Israel and have a defence force that really addresses our geopolitical needs and our geopolitical concerns and is part of de-escalating tensions in the region.
Is that still an uncomfortable message to take to the Greens base, though, that Australia would spend billions of dollars under the Greens on homemade missiles?
Well, this is part of some $77 billion in savings from cancelling AUKUS and a series of US weapons platforms. And a small proportion of that, some $4 billion, is reinvested in a domestic industry. That means we no longer import weapons from Israel. We don't support an industry that is engaged in that vile war in Gaza. We no longer are supporting US weapons platforms and the US military efforts to ratchet up tensions and drive conflict around the world. It's part of, I think, a challenging repositioning of how Australia can do this core task that we see, which is defend ourselves but not threaten our neighbours and send that signal to the region.
You mentioned before defending Australia's maritime region, scrapping AUKUS, removing the possibility of nuclear submarines down the track. What would you do about naval capability for Australia?
Well, we see that the naval capability is already in a terrible mess. There are a number of other announcements we'll be making as the election flows out. But, we see what an enormous, incredible mess that Labor and the Coalition have made. One of the projects that they have is a $45 billion Hunter frigate project where literally they're building ships at $7.8 billion apiece. The only ships that are more expensive than that on the globe are US nuclear aircraft carriers. There is such obscene waste in the defence budget, whether it's AUKUS or a number of other appalling procurement mistakes. We hear a lot of talk about increasing the defence budget. We think that is absolutely wrong. It's about cutting out the appalling waste. It's about ending the tens, hundreds of billions of dollars we're spending on AUKUS and refocusing that money on where it can most help in Australia.
Just on the relationship with the US, what should Australia's relationship with the US look like in the Trump era? And if we are going to start to distance ourselves from the US, who would we be drawing closer to?
Well, this is the argument that Labor and the Coalition have, that Australia can't have an independent foreign policy, that we need to cling to some great and powerful friend. And, I think the Coalition would still love us to be clinging to the UK. Labor and the Coalition want us to be clinging to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a danger for the region. He's a danger for Australia. And by clinging to the United States, we are far more likely to be involved in the next US war, which is almost certainly strongly against Australia's interest, strongly against the region's interest, strongly against what our push should be towards regional and global peace. So we see actually disentangling ourselves from the US military, disentangling ourselves from Donald Trump is actually the best thing we can do in the short term to protect Australia.
I just want to really briefly touch on the issue of salmon. I know it's not on your portfolio, but you're probably across what's been going on in Parliament House this week. Is there anything the Greens can do to stop the major parties from ramming through this legislation on Tasmania's salmon industry that's being discussed this week?
Well, we can work with the millions of Australians and resist over the next 3 days this push from the Coalition and Labor to gut Australia's environmental laws, drive a unique species into extinction. And what we've said to Labor is, don't do this. There are far better things to do with the last couple of sitting days in Parliament. Why don't we actually pass the funding to get the Medicare rebates up? Why don't we pass the funding to actually reduce HECS debt? And we're giving those proactive options to Labor, which I think if they took that to an election rather than trying to gut our environmental laws and drive a unique species into extinction, I reckon that would actually work for Labor going into this next election campaign. We're here to help.
David Shoebridge, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.
On that salmon issue, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has made no apologies for backing the Tasmanian salmon industry, which will be protected from legal action threatened by environmental groups under legislation expected to pass this week. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has previously indicated the Coalition would support the legislation, saying he'll stand with workers and claiming a re-elected Labor government would be disastrous for the sector. The Prime Minister says he will preserve jobs and manage environmental concerns.
The environmental science tells us that the skate is at the same levels that it was. back a decade ago. We responded to the science to provide certainty. My government makes no apologies for supporting jobs. That's what the Labor Party does. We support jobs, but we also support sustainability.
Senator Jackie Lambie was less than impressed, accusing the government of focusing their efforts on stinky little fish over cost of living relief. The senator has previously called for the salmon industry to leave Macquarie Harbour on Tasmania's remote west coast, suggesting the farms could go further out to sea.
I can guarantee the mining companies would never get out of it, would never get away with an exemption of what salmon's asking for tomorrow, because apparently that is what your government is prioritising tomorrow, talking about salmon instead of talking about reducing our energy bills in this country. That's what we're talking about, a stinking little fish tomorrow. So get your priorities right when it comes to this nation. We've had enough.
For more on this, the Liberal Senator for Tasmania, Jonathan Duniam, joined me earlier. Jonathan Duniam, thanks for joining Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
You've just been briefed on the government's new salmon legislation. Are you happy with the bill?
Well, we've been wanting to see this legislation now for more than a month. The Prime Minister promised it on the 15th of February. We wrote to him that day. We called his office. We called Tanya Plibersek's office, and until today we've had nothing. So we're working through the legislation. We want it to pass because it's what's necessary to end the uncertainty that the government created for this industry and the hundreds of workers on the west coast of Tasmania. So we'll make sure it does what they say it does do to provide that certainty, and if any changes need to be made, we'll work through them, but there's a bit of work to do just yet.
Peter Dutton was in Tasmania last week and said the Coalition would support this effort. So is there a world in which you vote this bill down?
Well, I want to leave Parliament this week with the bill having passed, because it's what Tasmanian salmon workers need. We've only got 2 days of Senate sitting and we've got to get it done in that time. But the government, having left it to the last minute, now need to work with us in good faith to ensure that any improvements needed are made, any loopholes that we find can be closed, because it is rushed by their own admission. Here we are the day before Parliament comes back, and we've got to make sure it actually does what they say it will, and that is provide those salmon workers certainty. So by the end of tomorrow, hopefully it's all done and good.
Yeah, we've been wondering for some time what the government is actually going to do here. Does this bill effectively just kill off this review into salmon farming in Macquarie Harbour? That's the essence of it.
Yeah, in effect, that would happen as a result of the legislation as I read it. It also prevents vexatious green groups from doing this sort of thing again to a degree in the future. I'm not 100% certain about how robust that process will be. We need to check that out. We're working with industry to see whether it does meet their expectations. We also need to talk to other experts who have an understanding of the law about how it might be applied. So there's a bit of work to do between now and when we vote on it in a final sense, but it is about providing that certainty and ensuring there aren't other avenues that these regular visitors to our courts, when they bring on green lawfare, can find to try and bring this industry to its knees.
Presuming this bill does pass, the Liberal Party have been strong campaigners, strong advocates for the salmon industry in Tasmania for some time. What does this mean for you politically? Does this negate this as an issue within Tassie?
No, I don't think so at all. I think Tasmanians are very well aware of the fact that Labor have been dragged here kicking and screaming. We weren't supposed to be sitting this week, so there wouldn't have been legislation, but for the fact that, of course, Tropical Cyclone Alfred, I believe, delayed things. So here we are, we're dealing with this legislation. There is also the very real spectre of a Labor Green government after this election if voters choose that. What would that mean for the salmon industry? They know where Labor are at on these issues in Tasmania. They remember what Labor did in partnership with the Greens to the forestry industry. This is the next industry on the chopping block, and I think Tasmanians are alive to that. This remains an issue, and the only way to save it is, of course, even with this legislation passing, make sure that a coalition government is elected. That's what we'll be telling Tasmanians.
On the flip side of that, though, it has been a pretty troubling few weeks for the salmon industry. There was a fish kill that killed a few thousand tonnes of salmon. There's been globules of salmon fat washing up on Tasmanian beaches. What do you say to those Tasmanians, those Australians as well, that would like to see more scrutiny of the salmon industry, not less?
Sure. Look, I think it's important not to conflate these two issues here. I mean, this is a very troubling time for the Tasmanian salmon industry and the community that was confronted by what you've just described. It was not good. And the industry themselves know that too. So there's a lot of work to do there to prevent that from ever happening again. But if I draw a comparison between the salmon industry and the poultry industry, where we have outbreaks of bird flu and they need to manage that and contain that. The reaction to bird flu in chicken farming is not going to result in the closing down of the industry. We work with industry to get it back on a stable footing and prevent further incursions or outbreaks of the bird flu. When you have a bacterial infection that takes out a huge portion of the salmon population, we should work with industry to help them develop vaccines to prevent this from happening again, because it's not good for the environment. It's not good for our brand. It wasn't good for humans who want to use our beautiful waterways and beaches. Industry want to prevent it from happening again, and I think it's something we can do with good fact-based science.
Just on some other issues in your portfolio, you've promised to make a decision on Woodside's massive North West Shelf extension within your first 30 days of taking office as a government. Can you do that legally? Can you require the department to provide you the brief of evidence that you'd need? And would making a decision in that sort of rushed process open you up to legal challenges?
Well, we've got to remember as well as part of this, Tom, that the Western Australian government have worked on this approval for 6 years for this extension. It's not a virgin project, it's not a new project, it's one that we all know about and we know what the impacts are. But for 6 years, they've been assessing it over in the West, and I think that we should see more reliance on state and territory governments who are the actual managers of on-ground activity in their states and territories. And having that 6-year process where all of those facts have been assessed, all of the questions been asked and answered, that should go some way to being able to expedite what we do at a federal level. I don't think there is any good reason why, given they have an approval over West, that we couldn't do the same here in an expedited fashion. Our request to the department would be, please have that information before the minister so a decision can be made within 30 days. I think that's entirely achievable, and it's what industry and the community would expect.
Do you think the courts will see it that way?
Well, I think the courts, if a question is put before them, will assess whatever's in front of them, and if the question is, are we opening up to legal challenges as a result of seeking to finalise a process? Well, in terms of those who bring forward legal challenges of these projects, it doesn't matter what you do. If it's not to knock a project on the head or reject it, you will find yourself in court. It doesn't matter how you frame up what you say, they will find a way to challenge it at law, and they have made an art form out of doing that. I don't think that should mean a government should shy away and hide from a decision to try and pursue a project. This government has done it. We're seeing it with North West Shelf now. By contrast, we want to see things progress. We want investors to have certainty. We want more gas coming on so that we can bring down power prices and support manufacturing. It's a pretty clear contrast, but we're never going to be able to appease the green groups. What we need to do is change the laws to prevent this green lawfare from going on.
Just on that question of more gas coming online, this is a key part of the coalition's pitch to push down power bills. What do you make of the idea of, a domestic gas reservation policy like what WA has in place already?
Yeah, well, look, we'd need to assess exactly how you'd manage that and what it would mean for the economy. I see that some of the crossbenchers have jumped on that idea and are pushing that today. It's all very well and good to talk about that, but we've got to also, as part of any proposition, have more gas coming on. And when we've just discussed North West Shelf, that's one example of projects that are delayed and held up by government processes. Well, it doesn't matter how much you reserve. If we're not bringing enough on, then we're not growing the amount that's there. The laws of supply and demand mean that prices will not come down. So we do need to bring more on to ensure that we can actually bring down power prices and support manufacturing and household costs from going down, or to go down.
John O'Donoghue, thanks for joining Afternoon Briefing.
Tom, thanks very much.
The husband of federal Victorian MP Monique Ryan has apologised after he was filmed removing a sign belonging to rival Kooyong candidate Amelia Hamer. Peter Jordan said he believed the sign was illegally placed and that he should have reported his concerns to council. Here's some of that exchange.
So, hang on mate, what are you doing?
I'm taking the sign down.
Yeah, beg your pardon?
It's not taking the sign down.
What are you doing that for?
Because it's on public land. It's not
who are you?
I'm not saying who I am.
Who are you? Or you're wearing a teal t-shirt?
I'll start to film you now.
Are you a Monique Ryan supporter, no, ripping down people's signs, are you? Is that what you're doing? That belongs to me. Hey, you can take it off the property, but it belongs to me.
All right, well, if it goes back up, it'll be taken down again.
There you go, Monique Ryan, there you go. Community values. Well done, mate.
Liberal Senator James Patterson claims there have been other instances of sign theft and says Teal MPs behave like this when no one's looking.
Monique Ryan really should front up today and explain her conduct and explain the conduct of her campaign. The Liberal Party's campaign in Kooyong has reported dozens of signs being stolen or vandalised over the last couple of weeks. Can Monique Ryan guarantee that her husband or her campaign were not involved in any of those instances of sign theft or those instances of sign vandalism?
Monique Ryan herself has also since apologised and says it should not have happened. One key area of interest in tomorrow's federal budget will be the National Disability Insurance Scheme, with the opposition suggesting it would tighten growth if it won government. Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume wouldn't give a figure on what level of growth the coalition would accept, only that it would be lower.
When we went into opposition, we said that we would work with the government to create some sustainable savings within the NDIS. In fact, Labor embedded in their budget an 8% growth rate in expenditure of the NDIS. That was down from 14%. Unfortunately, Labor haven't hit their own target on savings in the NDIS. That's going to be a problem.
Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in the Social Services and NDIS Minister, Amanda Rishworth. Minister, thanks for joining me.
Great to be with you.
Can I take you first to those comments from the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume? What did you make of them? And is there room to perhaps trim the NDIS further?
Well, firstly, I would say that Jane Hume has her numbers incorrect. The last year, the Liberals were in government. There was a 22% growth rate of the NDIS. So we've been working very hard to actually make this scheme sustainable. We've been working with people with disability, getting it back on track. And I have to say, Jane Hume is also wrong to say that we are not meeting our targets that we set. National Cabinet set the target of 8% growth by the 1st of July 2026. And this financial year, we had predicted that we would be at a 12% growth rate. Actually, we're doing better than that. The most recent figures coming out from the NDIA year to date is we are down to 10%. So we're actually working very diligently, but importantly, we're working with people with disability. Now, Jane Hume does have to be honest about what she would cut. We've been very clear about what our pathway is for reform. She has not been clear about what her cuts would be. Some of the suggestions about where growth should track at would suggest that no new participants could enter next year if she was to follow some of the comments that she has thrown around. So this would be deeply concerning if no new participants could enter the scheme in the next financial year. So look, unfortunately, I think Jane Hume hasn't actually looked back at the record of the Liberal Party when they were in government. 22% growth rate. We have got it down to 10%. We're on track to reach our 8% target. We will keep doing that, but in a way that has equity, fairness and transparency at its heart.
Yeah, to be clear, Jane Hume has said the first priority has to be hitting that 8% target. Are you confident that 8% target will be hit by the middle of next year?
Look, I have to say that I am very reassured about the progress that we've made. As I said, part of the way to meet that growth target was to reach 12% this financial year. The most recent data, they were the projections, the most recent data has suggested that we would are hitting 10%. So that is really significant progress that we've been making. But we've been making it by going back to the intent of the scheme. Not just random cuts to people, but actually going back to the intent of the scheme, which is clearly outlining what are NDIS supports and what are not. Making it clear that to work with people, to work within the budget of their plan. These are some of the changes we've made and we will continue to make progress. I'm very confident of us meeting that target.
Yeah, the Grattan Institute had some analysis out, I think, earlier this week or last week that suggested that hitting that 8% target won't be easy, but keeping growth below that 8% into the future would be particularly challenging. How do you constrain the growth of the NDIS into the future?
Well, of course, what we're doing is making sure that we go back to the original intent, and that's reasonable and necessary supports. I mean, some of the behaviour that we saw while the previous government was in office, that they did let a lot of fraud, actually flourish. So we have been very much focused on cracking down on fraud and dodgy providers as just one example. But it's also been being very clear about what is a NDIS support and what is not an NDIS support. How do we make sure that we have effective use of budgets and plans so that we have contained intra-plan growth is what it's called. And that is making sure that people are working and that the supports that they are getting are within their plan that they have received. So we're doing a lot of work there. That is how we have been able to achieve the reduction from 22% growth under the coalition. That's where we're making progress. But we know it's a challenge. We will continue to work with people with disability to ensure that we get the settings right, not make just gross cuts like it seems that the coalition is planning to do.
Part of that agreement at National Cabinet that you mentioned earlier was for the states to do more of the heavy lifting, to start to put in those services that perhaps had been in place before the NDIS was introduced that have since been removed. Have you seen any progress on that front? Are the states pulling their weight the way you'd like?
Well, what was in that agreement was actually funding, joint funding between the states and territories and the Commonwealth of supports outside the NDIS. I've been having very good conversations with my state colleagues, and we continue to work about what are some of the gaps, what are some of the services that they could deliver, what are some of the services that are needed. It's different in each state and territory. So that work is progressing, but it is not conditional on the progress that we've made. The progress that we've made around, for example, what is and isn't an NDIS support has been done separate to the work being done on foundational support. So we'll continue that work with our states and territories. I need to be clear that we offered co-funding with the states and territories, and we'll keep working with them.
I just want to briefly touch on some figures that came out over the weekend. You've suggested that the Liberal Party's or the Coalition's Super for Housing policy could wind up adding a $1.4 billion hit to the age pension down the track. What were the assumptions you made to get there? How did you get to that figure?
Oh, well, look, these were assumptions made by the PBO. It took a pretty conservative case of someone around the age of 40 withdrawing the $50,000 that the Coalition would allow them to do. What we already know from analysis done last week was that that potentially would add more than $70,000 to a house price. But what this evidence and the modelling shows is that having a situation where you can withdraw superannuation for housing would mean more people having to rely on the pension in their older age and would cost the taxpayer approximately $1.4 billion annually. So this is just bad policy all around. It's bad for taxpayers. It's bad for people who want to have a secure retirement and don't necessarily, after they've paid into super, want to rely on a full pension or a part pension. But it's also really bad at pushing up housing prices, actually making it more out of reach for more Australians to actually get into the housing market. So it's lose-lose.
Amanda Richworth, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
That's afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. See you soon.